Hi. Today I'm going to talk about organic fertilizers. You may remember we talked about this in plant science too. But before I talk about organic production a little bit more, I want to talk about nitrogen metabolism because essentially nitrogen is kind of the critical nutrient around everything. That's what everything sort of pivots on. So let's try to better understand how nitrogen is metabolized. So let's dig into. Um, there are two paths for nitrogen in plants, and it's important to be able to distinguish between the two. One is in the soil, which you've talked a little bit about, and the other is inside the leaf. So now inside the plant, nitrate, right? That's our nitrate fertilizer, is ultimately converted to ammonium in the leaves, which are then eventually converted to protein, which is what makes things happen in biology, right? Proteins are the little molecules that make you and me up and actually make a lot of the enzymes that are plants. So that's effectively what this is all about, is making proteins. So the plant is trying to move things around and shuffling the nutrients to ultimately get to this goal. Um, we spent a lot of time talking about ammonium and a nitrate, and we're going to continue again today, and maybe it'll make even more sense after today. I hope. This can be a complicated topic, so hopefully you follow with me okay. In the soil, and we've talked about this in plant science too, we know that bacteria do a lot of the heavy lifting. They do all the conversion from ammonium to nitrite and from nitrite to nitrate. So it's kind of really what causes some confusion in this topic is that right off the bat, you're going to see that in the plant, we're going from nitrate to ammonium, and in the soil, we're going from ammonium to nitrate. You might say, well, why not just absorb ammonium? Because ultimately that's where a closer step to protein, right? Well, there might be some validity to that statement, but let's follow the process and see where it goes. So nitrate is absorbed through roots, right? It's processed either in roots or leaves. It requires sugar to be processed to amino acids. So the plant has to expend energy to process it. And sugars are most abundant in leaves, which makes sense because that's where photosynthesis is happening. So you can see if you're going to process the nitrate in the roots, that means the plant has to move sugars all the way down to the roots, which is a rate limiting step. It slows the whole thing down. It costs energy. Um, so the plant's not really excited about that, if plants get excited. But effectively, the little industrial machines that they are, they're like, no, I really want to move that to the leaves if I can. Um, so they would rather move the nitrate to the leaves. That's their preference. So we have two scenarios. When nitrate levels in the soil are low, right? So there's not a lot of nitrate in the soil. The plant is anxious for that food. It's going to process it in the roots right away. When nitrate levels are high, it's processed in the leaves. So, obviously we're talking about agricultural context here. So typically nitrate levels are high. So that means that the plant's going to reallocate the nitrate to the leaves and process them there, which is the most efficient. So in the sense that sugar is abundant in the leaves and oxygen, which is important for the process, is also abundant. Now looking at ammonium, right? We've talked about ammonium and how as a nutrient we have to be careful with it because it creates soft growth, et cetera, et cetera. I also alluded to how ammonium is not really a good cold weather fertilizer. It's more of a warm weather fertilizer. So let's have a look at this. Ammonium in the roots needs to be converted immediately into something else because it is toxic to the plant. Um, and of course, that means that it's going to use oxygen and sugar because it has to be done in the roots, not in the leaves. So that has a metabolic cost. So ammonium has a cost, where nitrate has a cost, but it seems to be slightly less. So at cooler temperatures, right, that's when the root zone is cool, there's less sugar and less oxygen, which makes ammonium a poor choice. So we often talk about ammonia being a warm weather feed, not a cold weather feed. Um, so typically plants that need lots of sugar above the soil line, so plants that have either grow rapidly or have heavy fruit loads or very large flowers, like tomatoes, peppers, and rapid growth like lettuce, uh, they generally don't want any ammonium at all. They don't want to waste their sugar, and they have enough in the leaves up top, so they're going to want to be as efficient as possible. So they don't really want to move stuff down to the roots. So it's not really a good choice to be using ammonium in that context. So in warm, sunny conditions, ammonium may be a better choice than nitrate to some extent, right? You've got lots of oxygen, there's plenty of sugar, so it's confusing. But generally speaking, if you look at the industry fertilizers, what typically happens, to try to simplify this, is in the winter months, you'll see almost no ammonium in the recipe. And as we move to the summer months, ammonium starts to ramp up to maybe 40% of the fertilizer because the plants can actually handle it. There's enough going on. There's higher temperatures in the soil. You get nitrification happening. The plant's able to process it once it's in the root because there's more sugars available. Uh, whereas in cool temperatures, the bacteria in the soil are too slow. There's maybe not enough oxygen, and the plant has slightly less sugar because there's less daylight. It's just too much of a metabolic cost to rely on ammonium in the winter months. So here, in terms of sunny, warm conditions, right? This is sort of where ammonium might make sense. If you look going from nitrate all the way to protein, we have to go through nitrite, then ammonium, then glutamate, and then protein. That's how many steps are involved. Whereas if you feed ammonium, you go ammonium to glutamate and then directly to protein. So if conditions are such that the ammonium can be processed quickly enough without too much of a metabolic cost, ammonium can make sense. So that's why I'm saying that ammonium is really only applicable in the summer months when we have sufficient sugars, oxygen, and temperature to process it. Now, remember, we're talking about both soil and hydroponics here. And soil has bacteria, right, which are able to process the ammonium to nitrate in the soil, right? And that makes the entire thing work more effectively. Uh, Whereas in cold soil, the bacteria cannot process it, and you might end up with ammonium in the roots, which ends up having a toxic effect on the roots. Because remember, ammonium is not very good for the roots. It needs to be converted quickly to protein, but that happens up in the leaves. So very difficult to work with that. In hydroponics, there are no bacteria. Whoops, I was supposed to erase that. In hydroponics, there's no bacteria, so we do not get conversion of ammonium, right? So it accumulates in the roots quickly and can reach toxic levels. So that's why typically in hydroponics, you see very little, if not zero, ammonium. In fact, if you remember from your spreadsheet, the only ammonium you typically see is the amount that's contaminated in calcium nitrate. Remember, there is a small percentage. Oh man, I'm terrible at writing with my mouse. There's a small percentage of, I think it's 0.6% of by weight in fertilizer grade calcium nitrate is ammonium nitrate. So in soil, it's okay, provided there's enough temperature. So nitrification happens in soil, but not in hydroponics. It also happens in aquaponics. So remember, that is ammonium going to nitrite, going to nitrates. We have nitrosomas and we have nitrobacter that are doing all this work in the soil. And you may remember from Plant Science 2, I've used this picture many times, the idea that, nitrogen bacteria can produce ammonium. The ammonium goes through nitrifying bacteria to nitrates, and then they get converted to nitrates. And hopefully it is assimilated into the plant to make protein. but there are always competing bacteria if conditions become too cold or wet or insufficient oxygen, and they will actually convert the nitrate to nitrogen gas, and we lose it. So we don't want to grow too wet. You have your soil wet all the time, all your money and energy put into buying fertilizer is wasted because the denitrifying bacteria will just stump you and crush your nitrogen levels. So don't grow too wet. So what's the take home? Plants can use ammonium, but too much of it is toxic. Hydroponic uses ammonia uses too much sugar, and mainly because it has to be processed in the roots to avoid toxicity, and it slows growth, so we don't use it. And remember, any ammonium in the fertilizer will not be nitrified in the root zone, unlike soil. So again, in organics, we avoid it. In hydroponics. In soil, ammonium is converted to nitrite, which is toxic, and if it's cold, it takes too long to convert to nitrate, which means plants can be damaged. So we avoid too much ammonium when it is cold. So those are the key takeaways from that thing, right? So plants can use ammonium, but too much is toxic. Ammonium must be converted in roots. Fruiting plants will slow if sugar is used to basically convert ammonium. Leafy greens will slow down if there's too much ammonium present. Ammonia can be converted. I'm just reading this. You can read it too. I think I didn't realize I had so many summary slides. Oh yeah, this is a good one. Ammonium can be sprayed, so you can foliar feed it. Remember, we just talked about processing in soil and in roots, but if you spray it on the leaves, it's a shortcut. So foliar feed fertilizers often have ammonium in them, and you see a very rapid response in the plant. And there's a place for that. I've done it myself. There's a chemical called Nutrifog. What chemical? It's basically ammonium based fertilizer that's in a solution. Then you fog it in your greenhouse, and it will quickly absorb into the leaves, and you get a real boost in growth. If your crop is behind schedule, you can kind of catch up by almost a week by fogging a couple of times. Pretty cool trick. Also, remember, ammonia helps acidify the soil. So when you're designing a fertilizer program for in soil, it's a good idea to incorporate some ammonium because it will help keep the pH under control. If you just use nitrate alone in soil, then the pH will constantly creep up. Now, if you think about it, when we're doing hydroponics for this class, when we're working with the tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, do we ever add alkaline components to the tank? No, we always add acid. And the reason we're always adding acid is because our principal nitrogen component is nitrate, which raises pH. So in soil, you can have ammonium in the fertilizer mix, and then you can keep your root zone at the correct pH without having to constantly add acid. So you'll notice if you're growing in peat moss and coir, you're not really too concerned about pH as much because of the ammonium content. Another important thing that I added on here towards the end of this was, yes, ammonium is a cation, right? It has a positive charge, and as such, it can compete for other cations, namely calcium. And again, growing things like tomatoes, where blossom end rot can be a real problem, you definitely want to avoid ammonium in the fertilizer because you will end up outcompeting calcium at the roots, and the plant doesn't get enough calcium, and then you get blossom end rot. So this is yet another summary. Now this is good maybe to help you study for your final with this kind of stuff when you come back here to look at it. What do I want to highlight from here? Calcium, magnesium can be outcompeted with ammonium. We just talked about that. I'm going to skip that. All right, let's talk about organic fertilizers. Again, I did mention this is kind of picking up from plant science too, so you'll recognize some of this. Organic farming versus it's sort of like in your mind, we often think of, an old tractor and a nice big garden, people harvesting. But in truth, organic farming has become business, and it looks like this. It's not nearly as romantic, but organic farming is important. I looked up various definitions and I decided to go with the Encyclopedia Britannica one. Um, it is defined as an agricultural system that uses ecologically based pest controls and biological fertilizers derived largely from animal and plant wastes and nitrogen fixing cover crops. Modern organic farming was developed as a response to the environmental harm caused by the use of chemical pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, and has numerous ecological benefits. Some of that is debatable, but for the most part, I'd say it's true. I thought it was a fairly fair assessment. Um, so remember, organic fertilizers are not readily available to plants. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I find that students uh, struggle with this concept. You know, with our organic cucumbers, we added alfalfa meal and blood meal and all these different things, and we feel like we're fertilizing the crop, but really we're not. What's actually happening is we're feeding bacteria, and the bacteria have to process all those complex structures into the exact same molecules that we supply with synthetic fertilizers, because that's what plants look for. So they have to be mineralized, right? So bacteria have to break down, decompose. These are the decomposers: bacteria, protozoa, fungi. They have to decompose those organic fertilizers into the constituents that plants can use, which means they need the correct temperature, pH, and oxygen. Lastly, and I didn't talk much about this in Plant Science 2, but fungi are critical. We did talk about mycorrhizae, but fungi are also really critical in delivering nutrients to plants, specifically phosphorus. So yeah, plants do not absorb organic molecules. I really have to stress this because there's a lot of people selling stuff to home growers that are lying. Plants do not absorb organic molecules. They absorb inorganic molecules like ammonium, nitrate, phosphate, calcium, magnesium. They do not absorb enzymes. They do not absorb proteins. Only bacteria will consume those things, break them down into exactly these sorts of things, and then plants will absorb them. All right, so let's be clear on that. So when you're reading some of these bottles that you see at the hydroponic store, and they're adding all kinds of large complex molecules, beware that you're not necessarily buying something that plants can actually use. So yeah, I mean, as animals, we have stomachs that have bacteria and we have acids and enzymes that break down, but everything in our stomach actually breaks down whatever we eat into nitrate, ammonium nitrate, and phosphate, etc. So we're really no different, except we have an ecosystem in our stomach that's taking care of all that decomposition. All right, so let's move on. So organic fertilizers need conditions favorable to nitrifying bacteria. That's Nitrosomus and Nitrobacter that convert from ammonium to nitrite and nitrite to nitrate, which means we need oxygen, moisture, and warmth. Remember from the beginning of this lesson, if it's not warm, the bacteria cannot convert ammonium past nitrate very quickly, and we end up with too much nitrite in the soil, which causes toxicity to roots and actually can kill the plant or do a lot of root damage. And this is probably on a statement, again, I really sound like I'm repeating myself, but it's so important that everyone understands. There is not a single organic fertilizer that produces nitrate, that provides nitrate directly to the plant. There's no such thing. Which means that, what does that mean? What are the implications? It means that you're always working with potentially a lot more ammonium, and you have to be extra cognizant of the fact that you need sufficient temperature, moisture, and warmth for the organic fertilizers not to do damage, which means cool weather growing is very challenging. Or you have to just accept very slow growth and not push the crop because you will end up killing it. Now, oftentimes organic farmers probably never clued into this, because when you get root toxicity from nitrate levels, it looks like kind of Pythium or Phytophthora or Fusarium attacked the crop and it died. And they say, oh, it just bad luck. But really what happened was the roots suffered from root collapse from high nitrite levels because the bacteria were too cold. So important to make that distinction. I wanted to briefly talk about sugar because a lot of people buy sugar. You can buy, this is a bottle of molasses. People make their own. Sugar is a complicated topic because, of course, plants make sugar, right? And I just finished telling you that plants don't absorb large complex molecules, only inorganic molecules, and that is completely true. Where sugars came from, where the concept came from, is actually tissue culture. If you go back to your Plant Science 1 class, we do know that when tissues are removed from soil and put into a sterile, remember, sterile environment, that means no bacteria, sterile, then the plants can absorb the sugars and use them, especially if you take the tissue, cut it, stick it into a gel, and the tissues are so wet and soft that the cell walls are loose and things can easily move through the tissues to the membranes where sugars can pass across. You're bypassing the roots effectively. But let's be honest, growing in soil or hydroponics is far from sterile, and there are bacteria. And so adding sugar, what does it feed? Does it feed the plant? No, not really. What ends up happening is the sugars are consumed by bacteria. And unfortunately, it's 99% of the time it is the wrong bacteria. And sometimes even yeast grow and things get really ugly. When you have sugar in your soil, bacteria grow rapidly. Just think about, yeast and bacteria in your kitchen. When something goes horribly wrong, orange juice gets really bad. You can start to build pressure. If you're making beer at home and you add yeast, what do? You have sugar in the beer. You add yeast, and it rapidly grows and grows and produces all kinds of gas. And in the soil, what ends up happening is that this rapid growth of the wrong bacteria consumes nitrogen from the soil and consumes oxygen from the soil. So your plant really suffers when that happens. It's very dangerous. I can't see a real benefit from it at all. So typically we get fewer nutrients for plants and reduce oxygen. The only thing that can be a benefit from adding molasses is that molasses is fairly high in iron. And so if you have an iron deficiency in your crop, or your crop is growing at the wrong pH, if you oversupply iron through molasses, you may rectify the iron levels and the plant may look greener, but it will not grow better. And often shortly after you make it look a little better, things go downhill quickly because of the bacteria and yeast growth. So not a fan of this. I think this is a bad idea and it's not founded on science. And there's lots of people that are going to disagree with me on that on YouTube, but take this to a soil scientist or a plant scientist and they'll back me up on it. This, in case you want to look at it even more, this is beet molasses. All right, this is a fresh analysis of beet molasses, just molasses. Let's highlight a couple of things. Right off the bat, look at sodium. I think most of you know that plants do not like sodium. 82.75% of fresh weight is sodium. And then what little calcium, potassium, and iron you get, look at that, 0.4%. It's really not a lot. Yeah, there's some there, but not a lot. And the rest is water. So we're looking at sugar, water, and sodium. You tell me, what does your gut say about that, if it's helpful or not? So think that through if you're spending a lot of money at the hydroponics store. This is just another nitrogen cycle slide I found on the net to remind you of the ammonium to nitrite to nitrate to hopefully assimilation by plants, and if the soil conditions are incorrect, denitrification, loss to the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. And if you leach the nitrogen into the water, you get eutrophication and algae, which of course would be horrible and is what all the Florida ditches look like around the orange groves. I wanted to talk a little bit about OMRI. When you get into the world of organics, you'll see the term OMRI. That stands for Organic Materials Review Institute. That's an organization that was established in Eugene, Oregon to certify inputs. And it's important that I distinguish this is not an end product organic certifier, it is an inputs certifier. In order to grow organically, you need to certify all your inputs so that whatever comes out the other end is still certifiable. So OMRI certifies things like fertilizers, substrates, pest control products, and even preservatives for certain food products that are grown or produced organically. So again, I usually ask this question on the final. Make sure you understand that OMRI is just for input certification. Let's do a quick summary one more time of organic fertilizers now that you've had some time to sort of percolate over what you learned in Plant Science 2 and in the summer if you took that. So manure, which is a classic fertilizer used by a lot of people in agriculture, is actually a very complete fertilizer in the sense that it is balanced. Your NPK ratio is pretty balanced, but your numbers are very low, very, very low. Remember, manure is high in ammonium and urea, and it is a typically sold as composted, and to be honest, once you compost manure, there's almost nothing left. So not that that's not good for your soil, but compost manure has other benefits for your soil, but it will not have a massive nutritional benefit. So a lot of farmers use raw manure, which stinks and has food safety hazards and stuff like that. So you can't use it in all contexts, right? You're not going to spray raw manure in your tomatoes just before harvest. That would be disgusting. But when it's well composted, there's very little nutritional value. And a lot of the stuff does need decomposers to break it down to release that. So anyways, manure is popular in field production. I have not seen it other than our horse manure and our mushroom compost. But cow manure, goat manure, sheep manure, not seen it. Bone meal. Bone meal is one that we just got delivered at the college, which is pretty cool. Look at the ratios. You'll see basically it's high in phosphorus, which makes sense if you understand what bones are made of. They're made of a lot of phosphorus. It's kind of funny. You always think of bones as calcium. Oh, bones, calcium. Yeah, it's true. There is calcium in bones, but the vast majority of bone is made up of phosphate structures. So that's where grinding bone and using it as a fertilizer is an excellent way to get phosphorus into your soil. Really important in organic production that you use some sort of mycorrhiza inoculation to improve the delivery of the phosphorus. So if you're growing in soil and you have conditions that are favorable to mycorrhiza, then you want to do that because that will make it that much more efficient. In Plant Science 2, we talked briefly about some of the risks. I don't want to get into that stuff, but yeah, your bone meal, there could be cow diseases. Same with blood meal. But the blood meal have the college is also an excellent source of nitrogen, which is great for plants. It's also very high in iron because obviously blood has iron in it. That's how it holds oxygen. Blood meal is a fairly fast decomposer. So remember we talked in Plant Science 2 about different speeds and trying to match the speeds. Blood meal is very quick. So you got to watch what you're pairing it with if you want to keep your nutrients in balance. You also have to make sure you don't overdo it because too much iron is toxic, right? Remember we talked about micronutrient toxicities. So blood meal is very useful, but got to be careful. Typically, it is a ammonium form of nitrogen that it delivers. So keep that in mind as well, which is obviously very common in organic. Feather meal. Typically, we're looking at, basically decomposers that, so you're going to get nitrates and ammonium based on the conditions of the soil. It's a slow release, but it's also an excellent source of nitrogen. Probably a better match for slower potassium type fertilizers, but it's definitely a good one. I don't know. I talked in plant science too a little bit about some of my concerns about trace heavy metals because of feathers and drugs that are used with chickens. So, I mean, if you know your feathers are being sourced from an organic chicken farmer, that would be a lot better. But to be honest, there's not many organic chicken farmers, so it would be really difficult to source enough feathers. But I don't know of any organic feather meal that is actually has certified inputs. Um, yeah, that would be tricky. Maybe you should look, see if we can find an OMRI certified feather meal. I don't know. Um, Fish meal. This is one. Fish oil has been used. Fish meal. Essentially, what you're doing is you're adding protein to the soil, and then you're hoping the bacteria will convert that to nitrogen. It is a tricky one because that much protein, which is a fair amount. If the wrong bacteria start growing, things can kind of go bad pretty quickly. So you got to really know that you have enough oxygen, warm enough conditions, and not too wet and not too dry. So you got to be a confident grower to pull that off. Fish oil is a much quicker reaction, and you add smaller amounts, so you can sort of feed it, in a narrow window of time, and then have a break, as opposed to fish meal where you add it and now it's in there and you can't do anything for the next 3 to 6 weeks while it breaks down, right? So fish meal is a little quicker. It breaks down quicker because you're adding smaller water soluble amounts. I won't get into the FoxyQuinn stuff. Yeah, fish emulsion. Um, it's mostly from the industry that makes fish oil supplements, like cod liver oil additives, or what is it, beta omega fatty acids, those vitamin supplements you see in stores. It's big business. And so these little fish are harvested from the Atlantic and Caribbean Ocean and pressed for their oil. And the meal that's left over is treated with phosphoric acid uh, to preserve it. And so what actually happens when you have fish emulsion, it has phosphorus in it from the phosphoric acid. So it has a decent nitrogen source, a little bit of potassium, and it has phosphorus. And it lowers the pH. So it's not a bad, that's why often you see fish emulsion being used by organic farmers. Uh, and because it's a fairly fast decomposer, you get a bit of a more immediate response. Yeah, here's the picture of these schools of Manhattan little fish, like sardine things that are just basically scooped up and crushed. It's I don't know, feel a bit sad, but whatever. Um, Feather meal, talked about this back there. I don't really want to get into it again. Alfalfa meal, yeah, 2.5 to 1 to 1. We have this at the college. I like this. It's a nice, slow release, but not overkill. The only question you have is where and how was the alfalfa grown, right? Was it organic? Again, you have to find an OMRI certified one. I haven't. Um, Soybean meal. This is interesting. It can be phytotoxic. Again, we talked about that in plant science too a little bit, but certain things like lettuce and turnips, if you really want to grow turnips, please don't. But if you do, be careful. Some scientists figured out that soybean meal is actually toxic to them, and they not recommended for seedlings. Um, Cottonseed meal. This is a really important one for crops that need a low pH. It is one of the only fertilizers that will lower the pH of your soil, other than maybe fish meal a little bit because of the phosphoric acid. But cottonseed meal is really important for getting the pH down. Interestingly, coffee grounds will also lower pH if you use coffee grounds. So, algae meal. This is high-tech, futuristic stuff using human waste. I think at some point in the future you'll see this, but it's not widely done yet. But I like talking about it because I think it's so cool, and I know a lot of research has been done on it in preparation for the future. So, maybe when you guys are my age, it will be a little more mainstream, but not yet. It's too bad because I think it's really powerful. You can do a lot of stuff with algae. It's pretty cool. Seaweed kelp. We have this at the college. Remember 103. Uh, it is a low rate, slow to break down, and is high in potassium, which is really important because it's not a lot of potassium out there in the nutrients we've been talking about. So I think kelp is a good backbone for a lot of fertilizer programs. You know, it appears sustainable because it's kelp and the sea, but truth of the matter is that kelp provides habitats for like otters and fish to hide from predators. And you can imagine, now that the organic industry is fairly small, the footprint for harvesting kelp would be somewhat minimal. But, like everything, as it catches on, if it gets bigger, well, once again, there we are harvesting all the kelp, destroying a habitat. So I don't know. I mean, as much as I like it, I'm not sure if it's a long-term solution. And then guano, we talked a bit about that in plant science too, which is basically nitrogen. Uh, let's look at a couple of fertilizer breakdowns. This is cottonseed meal, phosphate, which is crushed stone, wood ash, limestone, crushed stone, and kelp meal. Uh, that is a pretty standard feed for a moderately acidic. Now you notice there's 4 parts cottonseed meal and wood ash. Wood ash is alkaline, cottonseed is acid. So they help offset each other so the pH doesn't go crazy. But you get a good source of potassium from the ash. That's one of the reasons why it's called pot ash, right? Um, and limestone also raises the pH, and that's your source of calcium, which of course calcium is very difficult to get in organic fertilizers. Not a lot of sources. Um, here's another complete organic fertilizer mix. These are examples of commercially available ones. So this is kelp meal, bone meal, soybean meal, and then we've got dolomitic lime and agricultural lime, which have calcium and magnesium in them. But these, I think it's a bit of a stretch to call it organic when you've got mined fertilizers in it. But realistically, if people are less dogmatic, some of the organic people are like crazy about this, but realistically, I think the future is a compromise. Instead of just saying you're in that camp, I'm in this camp, let's pick the best of both and make it work as sustainably as possible. And that's where, using some lime in the recipe makes some sense. Um, in the folder for this week, there's this spreadsheet. I did briefly show it to you in Plant Science 2. I would love it if you played with it. I don't have an assignment for this. I decided not to do that. Instead, we have the organic paper review, which I'll post probably on Wednesday for you to look at and do a summary. And I'll have all the instructions and what you need to do. But this is the only only spreadsheet I've seen where you can pick and choose different fertilizer inputs to achieve kind of a nutrient ratio. So just like your fertilizer assignment, we had target set points for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. And it's really difficult to do that with organic fertilizers. And so these researchers have come up with specific analyses and breakdowns, and then you enter in your number in the spreadsheet and it calculates the ratios that you would be applying. So it's a really useful tool for trying to build organic fertilizer that would have the correct ingredients for your crop. So this is just a picture of it. The actual spreadsheet is in the folder for, week 10. So, all right, that's organic. You learned a little bit about nitrogen metabolism. You're probably going to want to go through that a couple of times. Look at the slides. But the gist of it is, remember that the plant has to give up energy to process ammonium, and it has to make decisions. So when we supply lots of nitrate to the plant, not oversupply, but provide a fair amount, the plant can easily take it to the leaves and you get your maximum growth because it doesn't have to do a lot of conversion in the roots and shuffling. Think of it like moving inventory back and forth. It's just simple. Move the nitrate to the leaf, process it. But when when nitrates are at low levels, then the plant has to process it in the root right away, to make sure it has enough protein for everything. And then ammonium, remember ammonia has to go through a nitrite intermediate before it's converted to nitrate in the roots because it can't be absorbed directly. So that is where toxicity can be a problem if it's too cold because it doesn't get converted quickly. Um, but you can foliar feed ammonium if you want to sidestep all this to grow the quickest. But that is, not always feasible. Um, and then we talked about nitrogen in the soil, right? So bacteria being able to have sufficient temperature to convert ammonium to nitrate, so that we don't have toxicity in the roots. So there's some confusing overlap between inside the plant and inside the soil. So try to keep them separate, and that will help you understand how that all works. Okay, see you in the greenhouse.